Ezra Stoltzfus, a 50-year-old Amish farmer in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, has lived his entire life by the Ordnung, the unwritten rules that govern his community. After losing his wife Sarah to illness 2 years ago, his faith has grown rigid and cold. When he discovers an enormous donkey, nearly twice the size of any he's ever seen, abandoned in his back pasture, he initially sees it as a burden. But as word spreads through the Amish community and beyond, bringing unwanted attention and challenging his understanding of God's creation, Ezra must confront his grief, his faith, and what it truly means to trust in divine providence. The gentle giant will lead him on a journey that shatters his assumptions about God's plan and ultimately restores his capacity for wonder, love, and genuine faith. The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania hills like Sarah's quilts used to cling to their bed on cold winter mornings. Ezra Stoltzfus pushed the memory away as he stepped out of his farmhouse, the wooden porch creaking under his worn boots. At 50, his beard had turned more salt than pepper, and the lines around his eyes spoke of too many sunrises faced alone. "Another day the Lord has made," he muttered, though the words felt as stale as yesterday's bread. The ritual of morning devotion had become just that. Ritual without heart, duty without joy. The October air carried the sweet scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. Ezra pulled his black wool coat tighter around his shoulders and headed toward the barn. His 4 horses nickered their morning greeting, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. These were good animals, Belgians with strong backs and gentle hearts, bred for work, not for show. "Good morning, thunder, lightning," he said to the 2 geldings, then nodded to the mares. "Morning, Grace, Hope." The names felt foreign on his tongue now. Sarah had named them, back when hope wasn't just a word painted on a horse's stall. As he reached for the pitchfork to begin the morning feeding, something caught his eye through the barn's back window. In the far pasture, where the fence line met the Yorda property, stood a shape that didn't belong. Too large to be a deer, too still to be a person. Ezra squinted, wiping the frost from the glass with his sleeve. What in the world? He set down the pitchfork and walked to the back door of the barn, pushing it open with more force than necessary. The hinges protested with a groan that echoed across the quiet farmyard. Beyond the gate that led to his back 40 acres, approximately 50 yards away, stood the largest donkey Ezra had ever seen. The animal was easily the size of a draft horse, maybe large. Its coat was a deep, rich brown, almost chocolate, with the characteristic dark cross marking running down its back and across its shoulders. But everything else about it defied Ezra's understanding of donkey. This creature stood nearly 6 feet at the withers, with a powerful chest and legs like tree trunks. Its head was proportional, but massive, with ears that seemed to catch every sound for miles around. "Impossible," Ezra whispered, then caught himself. Nothing was impossible with God. The thought came unbidden, a remnant of the faith that had once burned bright in his chest. He walked across the frost-covered grass, his footsteps crunching in the silence. The donkey turned its great head toward him, and Ezra stopped, dead in his tracks. The animal's eyes were unlike any he'd seen, not just brown but deep and intelligent, almost human in their awareness. They seemed to look right through him, past his Amish uniform of plain clothes and black hat, past his carefully maintained exterior, into the hollow places where grief had carved out his heart. "Where did you come from, friend?" Ezra asked softly. Approaching the fence that separated them, the donkey took a step closer, its massive hooves making barely a sound on the soft ground, despite their size. The animal's movement was graceful, almost ethereal, despite its enormous bulk. It walked to the fence and lowered its great head, looking at Ezra with those penetrating eyes. Up close, Ezra could see the donkey was well fed and groomed, though there was no halter, no rope, no sign of human ownership. "You're not from around here," Ezra murmured, reaching out tentatively. The donkey allowed him to touch its neck, the coat soft and warm under his weathered palm. "No, sir, "You're not from anywhere around here." Ezra had been around livestock his entire life. His father, Amish Stoltzfus, had taught him to judge horseflesh before he could properly hold a pitchfork. This donkey defied everything he knew about the species. Donkeys were small, sturdy creatures, good for light work and sure footing on rough terrain. They were stubborn, practical animals, useful but unremarkable. This creature was remarkable in every way. The donkey's breathing was steady and calm, no sign of distress or exhaustion, despite having no obvious shelter during the cold night. Its coat showed no signs of weather damage or neglect. If anything, it gleamed in the morning light as if it had been roosted and cared for by invisible hands. "Well," Ezra said, stepping back from the fence, "I suppose you're my problem now. Can't have you wandering around causing talk. The English already think we're strange enough without giant donkeys appearing on our farm." The donkey continued to watch him with those unsettling eyes, as if it understood every word. Ezra shook his head and turned to go back to the barn. He had morning chores to finish, and then he'd need to make some phone calls. Someone in the county must be missing a donkey, even one as unusual as this. But as he walked away, he could feel those eyes following him, and something in his chest, something that had been cold and hard for 2 long years, began to stir. It was a feeling he didn't recognize at first, rusty from disuse. When it finally came to him, he stopped walking and turned back to look at the enormous creature still standing by his fence. Wonder. That's what he was feeling. Pure, simple wonder at God's creation. "Sarah," he whispered to the morning air, "what do you suppose the Lord is up to now?" The donkey raised its head as if it had heard him speak his wife's name, and for just a moment, Ezra could have sworn he saw something that looked like understanding in those deep brown eyes. By the time he finished his morning chores, the sun had burned away the mist, and the donkey had moved to the shade of the old oak tree that marked the corner of his property. It seemed content to graze on the autumn grass, paying no attention to the fence that separated it from Ezra's land. It could easily have jumped or pushed through the aging barrier, but it remained respectfully on what Ezra assumed was still public or neighboring property. Ezra found himself glancing toward the pasture every few minutes as he worked. The donkey's presence was both calming and unsettling. There was something about the animal that demanded attention, not through braying or movement, but through its simple, magnificent existence. After finishing the morning milking and feeding, Ezra walked to his neighbor's house. Jacob Yudah was 10 years his senior and had been a close friend of Ezra's father. If anyone would know about unusual livestock in the area, it would be Jacob. "Ezra," Jacob called from his vegetable garden, where he was pulling the last of the season's carrots. "Good morning to you. How are you keeping?" "Well enough, Jacob. Well enough." Ezra approached the garden fence, removing his hat out of respect for the older man. "I wonder if I might ask you something." "Of course. Of course. What troubles you? Do you know anything about a donkey?" "A very large donkey. It's in the back pasture, right along our property line." Jacob straightened, his weathered hands still holding a bunch of orange carrots. His expression grew puzzled. "A donkey? No, I know of no donkeys in these parts. The Millers have mules, and the Bylers have those miniature horses, but no donkeys, certainly none that I would call large. This one is, well, it's quite something to see. Nearly the size of thunder or lightning." Jacob's eyebrows rose. Thunder and Lightning were Ezra's largest draft horses, each standing over 17 hands high and weighing close to 2,000 pounds. "That would be some donkey," Jacob said slowly. "Are you certain it's a donkey and not a mule?" "I know the difference, Jacob. This is a donkey, sure as I'm standing here. But unlike any I've ever seen." Jacob set down his carrots and walked to the fence that separated their properties. He was too far away to see the animal clearly, but he shaded his eyes with his hand and peered toward Ezra's back pasture. "I don't see anything just now," he said. Ezra turned to look. The donkey had moved deeper into the shade of the oak tree and was partially hidden by the trunk. Only its hind quarters were visible from this angle. "It's there," Ezra said. "Been there since dawn, maybe before." "Well," Jacob said thoughtfully, "the Lord works in mysterious ways. Perhaps someone will come looking for it soon." "Perhaps." Ezra replaced his hat and nodded. "If you hear anything, will you let me know?" "Of course." "And Ezra," Jacob's voice took on a gentler tone, "how are you really doing? It's been 2 years since Sarah passed, and we worry about you." The familiar tightness gripped Ezra's chest at the mention of his wife. "I'm managing, Jacob. The Lord provides." "He does indeed, but he also provides community, friendship, help when we need it." "You don't have manage alone." Ezra nodded but said nothing more. He had heard this conversation many times over the past 2 years. Well-meaning friends and neighbors, concerned about his isolation, his withdrawal from the social life of their community. They meant well, but they didn't understand. The Lord had taken Sarah for his own reasons, and Ezra's job was to accept that and continue on. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford, and healing felt like betrayal. "I should get back," he said. "Thank you, Jacob." As he walked home, Ezra could see the donkey had moved again, this time to a spot where it was fully visible from the path. It stood perfectly still, watching him approach, and Ezra had the strangest feeling that it had been waiting for him. The rest of the morning passed quietly, but Ezra found himself returning to the back fence repeatedly. Each time the donkey acknowledged his presence with a gentle movement of its great head, but otherwise continued its peaceful grazing. There was something deeply calming about the animal's presence, something that Ezra couldn't quite name. It wasn't until he was preparing lunch that he realized what it was. For the first time in 2 years, he wasn't thinking about Sarah's absence. He wasn't calculating how many hours until bedtime, or how many more days of emptiness stretched ahead of him. His mind was occupied with wonder at this mysterious creature, and the grief that usually sat like a stone in his chest had lightened. Just a little. The thought should have brought him relief. Instead, it brought guilt. How dare he find distraction from his sorrow? How dare he feel anything but the weight of loss? He set down his sandwich uneaten and walked once more to the back pasture. The donkey was lying down now, resting in the shade, but it raised its head when it saw him coming. "What are you?" Ezra asked aloud. "Where did you come from? And why do I feel like you're here for a reason?" The donkey climbed to its feet with surprising grace and walked to the fence. This time, it pushed its massive head over the top rail, bringing those intelligent eyes level with Ezra's face. They stood that way for a long moment, man and beast, studying each other in the afternoon sunshine. And in that moment, Ezra felt something he hadn't felt since Sarah died. He felt seen, not judged, not pitied, not worried about, just seen, and accepted exactly as he was. "Tomorrow, I'll make some calls," he said softly, reaching up to scratch behind the donkey's enormous ears. "Someone must be looking for you." But even as he said the words, Ezra found himself hoping that maybe, just maybe, no one would claim this gentle giant. Maybe, for once, something good could stay. The donkey seemed to understand his thoughts. It lowered its head and, with infinite gentleness, touched its muzzle to Ezra's chest, right over his heart. For the first time in 2 years, Ezra Stoltzfus smiled. The next morning brought visitors. Ezra had barely finished his coffee when he heard the rumble of an automobile engine coming up his gravel drive, an unusual sound in a community where horses and buggies were the norm. Through his kitchen window, he watched a white pickup truck with Lancaster County Animal Control painted on the side come to a stop near his barn. A man in his 30s stepped out, wearing a khaki uniform and carrying a clipboard. He was followed by a woman with a camera hanging around her neck, clearly not official personnel. Ezra sighed and set down his mug. He had made those promised phone calls the previous evening, inquiring with the local veterinarian and animal control about any missing donkeys. Apparently, word had spread faster than he'd anticipated. Mr. Stoltzfus, the uniformed man called as Ezra stepped onto his porch. I'm Officer Dave Martinez from Animal Control. We got a report about an unusually large donkey on your property. That's correct, Ezra replied, not moving from his porch. Though I should clarify, it's not exactly on my property. It's been staying just beyond my back fence line. The woman with the camera stepped forward eagerly. Mr. Stoltzfus? I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Lancaster Gazette. Would it be possible to see this donkey? We've heard some pretty incredible reports about its size. Ezra felt his jaw tighten. This was exactly what he had hoped to avoid. English attention, cameras, people treating God's creation like a circus act. I suppose you can look, he said reluctantly, but I ask that you be respectful. It's a gentle creature, and I won't have it frightened or harassed. Of course, Officer Martinez assured him. We just need to verify the reports and check if it's healthy and belongs to anyone. Ezra led them around the barn toward the back pasture, his stomach knotting with each step. The donkey was where it had spent most of yesterday, near the old oak tree, but as soon as it saw the approaching group, it raised its magnificent head and stood to its full impressive height. Holy! Officer Martinez caught himself and coughed. That's definitely not a normal donkey. Jennifer Walsh was already snapping photos, her camera clicking rapidly. This is incredible. How long has it been here? 2 days, Ezra answered curtly, wishing he had never made those phone calls. The donkey watched the strangers with its intelligent eyes, but showed no signs of fear or agitation. If anything, it seemed merely curious about the new visitors, tilting its head slightly as if trying to understand their excitement. Officer Martinez walked closer to the fence, pulling out his own camera phone. I've never seen anything like this. The proportions are all wrong for a donkey, but the markings, the ears, the head shape, it's definitely not a horse or mule. Could it be some kind of hybrid? Jennifer asked, still photographing from every angle she could manage. I honestly don't know, Martinez admitted. I'll need to contact some specialists. In the meantime, Mr. Stoltzfus, are you comfortable with the animal staying here? It doesn't appear to be causing any problems, and it seems healthy enough. Ezra nodded, surprised by his own relief. It's no trouble. As I said, it's not technically on my land, and it's been peaceful. Well, this is quite a story, Jennifer said, finally lowering her camera. Mr. Stoltzfus, would you be willing to answer a few questions for our paper? No, Ezra said firmly. I would not. Oh, come on. Just a few questions about when you first saw it, what you think it might be. I said no. Ezra's tone brooked no argument. You've seen the animal. That should be sufficient for your purposes. Jennifer looked disappointed, but didn't press further. Officer Martinez made some notes on his clipboard and promised to return if he learned anything about the donkey's origins. As they prepared to leave, Jennifer handed Ezra a business card. In case you change your mind, she said. This could be a really heartwarming story. Ezra pocketed the card without looking at it and watched them drive away. When their truck disappeared down the lane, he turned back to the donkey, which was now grazing peacefully as if nothing had happened. Well, friend, he said, I'm afraid your quiet days might be numbered. He was right. By afternoon, word had spread through the Amish community like butter on warm bread. First came Samuel King, the local blacksmith, with his 3 youngest sons in tow. They stood at the fence for nearly an hour, marveling at the donkey's size and gentle demeanor. Never seen the like, Samuel kept saying, shaking his graying head. Never in all my days. His youngest boy, barely 5 years old, had climbed onto the fence rail and was making soft clicking sounds at the donkey. To Ezra's amazement, the massive creature walked over and allowed the child to pet its nose. Papa, look how soft it is, the boy exclaimed. Be careful, Moses, Samuel warned, but the donkey stood perfectly still, seeming to understand it was interacting with someone small and vulnerable. Next came the Byler family, then the Lapps, then neighbors Ezra hadn't spoken to in months. By evening, It felt like half the district had made pilgrimages to see the mysterious donkey. Each visitor left shaking their head in wonder, promising to spread the word about the miracle animal on the Stoltzfus farm. Ezra found himself growing increasingly uncomfortable with the attention. This wasn't the Amish way. Spectacle and wonder-seeking belonged to the English world, not to their plain community. Yet he couldn't bring himself to turn away neighbors who were genuinely curious about God's creation. The next morning brought more visitors, but these weren't neighbors. 3 cars and a van pulled into his drive before sunrise, disgorging people with cameras, notebooks, and equipment. Ezra couldn't identify Mr. Stoltzfus. A woman in a bright red coat called out as she approached. "I'm Rebecca Martinez, from Channel. We'd love to do a story about your donkey." Behind her, a man was already setting up a large camera while others unloaded what appeared to be lighting equipment. Ezra felt his heart begin to race with anxiety and anger. "You need to leave," he said firmly, not coming down from his porch. "This is private property, and you don't have permission to be here." "We just want to get a few shots of the donkey," another reporter called out. "It'll only take a minute," I said. "Leave now." But they were heading toward his back pasture, cameras and equipment in hand. Ezra hurried after them, his plain black coat flapping behind him as he tried to intercept the growing circus. "Stop," he called, but they were already at the fence, exclaiming over the donkey's size and positioning themselves for the best shots. The donkey, which had remained calm through all the previous visits, seemed disturbed by the chaos and noise of the television crew. It moved away from the fence, closer to the oak tree, its ears back in a sign of stress that Ezra recognized immediately. "You're frightening it," Ezra said, pushing through the crowd. "I asked you to leave. Just a few more shots," the cameraman said, adjusting his equipment. "This is incredible footage." The reporter in the red coat was speaking rapidly into a microphone. The donkey visible in the background, mysterious giant donkey that appeared overnight on an Amish farm in Lancaster County. Local authorities are baffled by the animal's extraordinary size. Ezra had heard enough. He strode to his barn and returned with a large sheet of plywood, which he began positioning to block the camera's view of the pasture. The move sparked protests from the news crew, but Ezra ignored them, methodically blocking their sight lines with whatever materials he could find. "Miss Stoltzfus, please," the reporter called. "This is a story that could bring positive attention to your community." "My community doesn't want your attention," Ezra replied, securing another piece of plywood to his fence. Positive or otherwise. It took another hour, but eventually the television crews packed up and left, though not before promising to return. Ezra stood in his yard, surveying the damage to his peaceful morning, and felt a deep weariness settle into his bones. The donkey had remained hidden behind the oak tree during most of the commotion, but now it emerged and walked slowly to the fence where Ezra stood. Those intelligent eyes seemed to understand his distress, and the great creature lowered its head in what looked like sympathy. "I'm sorry, friend," Ezra said softly. "I never meant for this to happen." The afternoon brought a different kind of visitor. Bishop Eli Hostetler, leader of their church district, driving his black buggy with the measured pace of a man who had something important to discuss. Ezra met him at the front gate, removing his hat in respect. "Bishop Hostetler, good afternoon." "Ezra." The bishop was a man of few words, tall and lean with a grey beard that reached nearly to his chest. "I've come about this donkey." "Yes, sir. There's been considerable talk, people coming and going, English, with their cameras and newspapers." "This isn't our way." "No, sir, it isn't. I've tried to discourage them, but word has spread beyond our control." Bishop Hostetler climbed down from his buggy and tied his horse to Ezra's fence post. "Show me this animal that's causing such a stir." They walked to the back pasture in silence. The donkey was resting in its favorite spot, under the oak tree, but it rose when it saw them approaching and walked to the fence with its characteristic grace and dignity. The bishop stopped walking and stared. For a long moment he said nothing, just stood studying the enormous creature, with the same wonder that had struck everyone who saw it. Finally he spoke. "It's certainly unusual." "Yes, sir." "Have you determined where it came from?" "No, sir. I've made inquiries, but no one has reported a missing donkey, especially not one like this." Bishop Hostetler approached the fence slowly. The donkey watched him with calm eyes, showing no fear of this new human. When the bishop reached out tentatively, the animal allowed itself to be touched, even seeming to lean into the gentle contact. "It's remarkably tame," the bishop observed. "Yes, sir. Gentle as a lamb, despite its size." They stood roitedly for several minutes, both men studying the donkey studying them in return. Finally, Bishop Hostetler stepped back from the fence. "The English attention must stop, Ezra. We can't have television cameras and reporters disrupting our community peace." "I understand, Bishop. I'll do whatever is necessary." "Good." The older man paused, still looking at the donkey. "Though I must say, it's a magnificent creature. The Lord's creation never ceases to amaze." Something in his tone made Ezra look at him more closely. There was wonder in the bishop's eyes, the same wonder Ezra had felt that first morning. Despite his concerns about the attention the animal was drawing, even their spiritual leader was not immune to the donkey's mysterious appeal. "What would you have me do?" Ezra asked. "Keep it if no owner can be found. But quietly, no more cameras, no more reporters. If the English want to gawk at God's creation, they can go to their zoos, and if they come anyway, then you turn them away, as is your right on your own land. We'll support you in this." Ezra felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had been afraid the bishop would order him to get rid of the donkey, to avoid the complications it was bringing to their peaceful community. Instead, he was being given permission to protect it. "Thank you, Bishop." "Don't thank me yet. This animal has brought change to your life, Ezra. Change isn't always comfortable, but sometimes it's necessary." There was something in the bishop's words that suggested deeper meaning, but before Ezra could ask what he meant, the older man was already walking back toward his buggy. "Give my regards to the brethren," he called as he climbed onto his seat. "And Ezra, perhaps it's time you rejoined us for Sunday services. It's been too long." Ezra watched the black buggy disappear down his lane, the bishop's words echoing in his mind. It had been months since he'd attended church, claiming farm duties that everyone knew were excuses. His grief had driven him away from community, from fellowship, from everything that had once given his life meaning beyond mere survival. He turned back to look at the donkey, which had settled down in the grass but was still watching him with those remarkable eyes. "What are you trying to tell me, friend?" he asked aloud. "First you bring wonder back into my life, then you bring half the county to my door, and now the bishop is talking about change and church. What's the Lord up to?" The donkey didn't answer, of course, but it climbed to its feet and walked to where Ezra stood at the fence. Once again it lowered its great head and gently touched its muzzle to Ezra's chest, right over his heart, and once again Ezra felt that stirring of something he'd thought was dead forever. Not just wonder now, but 3 days after the bishop's visit, Ezra was awakened before dawn by the sound of voices in his yard. He pulled on his clothes quickly and stepped onto his porch to find a sight that made his heart skip. A young Amish couple stood near his barn, the woman cradling a small child who was clearly very ill. "Please forgive us," the man called out when he saw Ezra. "I'm David Yoder, Jacob's nephew from over in Bird in Hand. This is my wife Mary, and our daughter Ruth." Ezra hurried down from his porch, pulling his coat around his shoulders. In the pale pre-dawn light he could see that the child was perhaps 3 years old, her face pale and drawn with fever, her breathing labored and shallow. "What's wrong? Do you need help getting to a doctor?" "No," Mary Yoder said softly, her voice thick with exhaustion and worry. "We've been to the doctors, 3 of them. They say there's nothing more they can do." David's voice was steady but strained. "Ruth has been sick for weeks. Some kind of infection in her lungs that won't respond to medicines. The doctors at Lancaster General say we should prepare ourselves." The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. He remembered standing in that same hospital, hearing similar words about Sarah, the helplessness, the rage at God for allowing such things to happen to innocent people. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "So very sorry. But why have you come here?" Mary and David exchanged a look. "We heard about the donkey," Mary said. "People are saying it's special, that God sent it for a reason. Some are calling it a miracle," David added. "We know it sounds foolish, but we have nowhere else to turn. We hoped, maybe if Ruth could see it, touch it." Ezra felt his chest tighten with familiar anger. People turning God's creation into some kind of magic charm, looking for miracles in all the wrong places. "It's just a donkey," he said, more harshly than he intended. "A large donkey, yes, but still just an animal. It can't heal anyone." Mary's face crumpled, and she held her daughter closer. "Please," she whispered, "please, just let her see it. We have nothing left to hope for." The raw desperation in her voice reminded Ezra so sharply of his own prayers during Sarah's final days that he couldn't speak for a moment. He had begged God for miracles too, had bargained and pleaded and raged, and God had remained silent while the woman he loved slipped away. But looking at this young family, at the dying child in her mother's arms, Ezra found he couldn't turn them away. Not because he believed the donkey could heal anyone, but because he remembered what it felt like to need hope, even false hope, to get through another day. "All right," he said softly. "Come along." They walked to the back pasture in silence, the only sounds their footsteps on the frost-covered grass and the child's labored breathing. The donkey was standing alert near the fence, as if it had been waiting for them. In the growing light of dawn, its massive form seemed almost ethereal, like something from a dream. "Oh my," Mary breathed. "It's beautiful." The donkey walked to the fence immediately, its intelligent eyes fixed not on the adults but on the sick child. Mary approached hesitantly, holding Ruth out toward the animal. "It's all right, little one," she whispered to her daughter. "See the pretty donkey?" Ruth's fever-bright eyes focused on the enormous creature with effort. She made a small sound, not quite a word, and reached out with one tiny hand toward the donkey's muzzle. The donkey lowered its great head carefully, bringing its nose close enough for the child to touch. Ruth's fingers brushed against the soft gray muzzle, and for a moment, everyone held their breath. Nothing happened. No flash of light, no sudden healing, no miracle. Just a sick child petting a gentle animal while her parents watched with breaking heart. But then something did happen. Something small and quiet and easy to miss. Ruth smiled. It was barely there, just a tiny upward curve of her pale lips. But it was the first time she had smiled in weeks, according to her mother's soft gasp. "Ruth?" Mary whispered. "Sweetheart?" The child made another soft sound, and this time it was clearly a word. "Pretty." David's eyes filled with tears. "She hasn't spoken in 4 days," he said hoarsely. The donkey seemed to understand the significance of the moment. It remained perfectly still, letting the child pet its nose and muzzle, while she whispered, "Pretty donkey," in a voice like rustling leaves. They stayed for nearly an hour as the sun rose fully, painting the pasture in shades of gold and amber. Ruth remained alert and responsive longer than she had in days, talking to the donkey in her small, weak voice, even managing a tiny laugh when the animal nuzzled her hand. But eventually the effort became too much, and she slumped against her mother's shoulder, exhausted. The brief spark of life that had animated her faded back to the dull fever brightness that spoke of a body fighting a losing battle. "We should go," David said reluctantly. "Thank you, Ezra. This meant everything to us." She seemed stronger, Mary added, hope and desperation warring in her voice. "More like herself." Ezra nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had seen what they had seen, the child's brief rally, her smiles, her words, but he had also seen the underlying truth that hadn't changed. Ruth was still dying, still slipping away from parents who loved her more than life itself. As the Yoder family prepared to leave, Ruth lifted her head one more time and looked back at the donkey. Bye-bye, pretty donkey, she whispered. The massive creature watched them go with those enigmatic eyes, then walked slowly back to its favorite spot under the oak tree. Ezra stood at the fence for a long time after they left, wrestling with emotions he couldn't name. The donkey had done nothing supernatural, nothing that could be called a miracle by any reasonable measure. And yet, there had been something in that interaction, something that transcended the ordinary relationship between human and animal. He was still standing there when Jacob Yoder arrived an hour later, his face grave. "I heard David and Mary were here," Jacob said without preamble. "Yes. They brought their daughter to see the donkey." "And," Ezra shrugged, "she seemed to enjoy it, smiled a little, talked to it, but she's still very sick, Jacob. Whatever people are hoping this animal can do, it can't work miracles." Jacob was quiet for a moment, studying the donkey in the distance. "Perhaps," he said finally, "or perhaps miracles aren't always what we think they are." Before Ezra could ask what he meant, Jacob continued, "Word is spreading, Ezra. Beyond our community, beyond even the English reporters, people are starting to come from far away. Sick people, desperate people. They're calling your donkey the Lancaster miracle on the internet." Ezra felt his stomach drop. The internet? David and Mary aren't the only ones who've heard the stories. There are people driving here from other states, making pilgrimages like it's some kind of holy site. Bishop Hostetler is concerned. As if summoned by their conversation, a car pulled into Ezra's driveway, a sedan with Pennsylvania plates, but clearly not local. A middle-aged woman got out, moving slowly with the aid of a walker, followed by what appeared to be her adult son. "Mr. Stoltzfus," the woman called. "We've driven down from Scranton to see the healing donkey. I have multiple sclerosis, and the doctors say I don't have long before I'm completely bedridden. Please, can I see it?" Ezra looked at Jacob, who shook his head grimly. "It's going to get worse," the older man said quietly. "Much worse." Over the next 2 hours, 3 more cars arrived. A man with cancer from Harrisburg, an elderly couple whose grandson had been in a coma for 6 months, a young mother with a baby born with a severe heart defect. Each came with the same desperate hope, the same willingness to believe that this mysterious animal might hold the key to healing their loved ones. Ezra found himself caught between compassion and frustration. These were people in pain, people who had exhausted medical options and were grasping at spiritual straws. He couldn't bring himself to turn them away, but neither could he encourage false hope. He led each group to the back pasture, where the donkey received them with the same gentle dignity it had shown everyone else. The animal seemed to sense the sickness and desperation in its visitors, responding with extra patience and gentleness. Children reached through the fence to pet its nose, adults wept as they touched its neck, and families prayed together in its presence. But there were no miracles, no sudden healings, no dramatic recoveries, just a large, gentle animal offering comfort through its peaceful presence. By evening, word had spread further, and Ezra's phone was ringing constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, television producers pitching documentary ideas, and most disturbingly, people from around the country begging for information about visiting the miracle donkey. "This has to stop," Ezra told the donkey, as he stood by the fence in the gathering dusk. "These people are looking for something you can't give them, and I'm afraid of what will happen when they realize that." The donkey walked to the fence, and in its now familiar gesture, touched its muzzle gently to Ezra's chest. But this time, something was different. This time, Ezra felt a warmth spread from the point of contact. Not physical warmth, but something deeper, something that touched the cold, hard places in his heart, where grief had taken root. For just a moment, he felt the presence of something greater than himself, greater than his pain, greater than his limited understanding of how the world worked. It wasn't healing in the way the desperate visitors were seeking. It was something more subtle and perhaps more profound. It was peace. The feeling lasted only seconds, but it left Ezra shaken. He stepped back from the fence, staring at the donkey with new eyes. "What are you?" he whispered. The donkey tilted its massive head, studying him with those intelligent eyes, and Ezra had the strangest feeling that it was asking him the same question. What are you? What are you becoming? What are you willing to believe? That night, Ezra barely slept. He kept thinking about little Ruth Yoda, about the brief moments of joy and connection she had experienced with the donkey. He thought about the other visitors, the desperate, the dying, the grieving, and how they had found something in the animal's presence, even if it wasn't the miracle they were seeking. Most of all, he thought about that moment of peace he had felt, that sense of being part of something larger than his own suffering. At 3 in the morning, he gave up on sleep and walked to his kitchen window. In the moonlight, he could see the donkey standing in the pasture, a dark silhouette against the silver grass. The animal seemed to be looking toward his house, as if it too were wakeful and watchful. "Sarah," Ezra said to the empty kitchen, "I don't know what's happening to me. For 2 years I've been so angry, so sure that God had abandoned us. But this animal, there's something about it that makes me remember what it felt like to believe, to hope, to see wonder in the world." He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. "These people who come here, they're looking for miracles, and I keep telling them there aren't any. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the miracle isn't healing their bodies. Maybe it's healing their hearts, their hope, their faith." The donkey lifted its great head as if it had heard him, and for a moment Ezra could have sworn he saw Sarah standing beside the massive creature, her hand resting on its neck, her face peaceful and whole. When he blinked, the vision was gone, leaving only the donkey standing alone in the moonlight. But the peace he had felt earlier returned, stronger this time, and with it came a certainty that would have seemed impossible just days before. This animal, wherever it had come from, whatever it truly was, had not arrived by accident. It was here for a purpose, and that purpose somehow included him. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The next morning brought chaos that would test everything Ezra thought he understood about faith, community, and the mysterious ways of providence. He woke to the sound of car doors slamming and voices, dozens of voices coming from his front yard. When he looked out his bedroom window, his heart sank. The small gravel lane that led to his farm was lined with vehicles, cars, vans, RVs, and even a few buses. People were streaming across his property, some carrying camping chairs, others with signs that read "Miracle Donkey" and "God's Healing Touch." Someone had set up what appeared to be a makeshift information booth near his mailbox, complete with a banner that proclaimed Lancaster County Miracle Tours, $20 per person. Ezra dressed quickly and hurried outside, his anger building with each step. A woman with a megaphone was directing the crowd toward his back pasture, while a man in an expensive suit was collecting money from visitors. "Stop!" Ezra called out, but his voice was lost in the commotion. "This is private property." The man with the megaphone noticed him first. "Are you the owner? Great. I'm Rick Pemberton from Miracle Tours. We've brought about 200 people to see your healing donkey. Don't worry. We're collecting a small fee to cover our expenses, and of course we'll give you a percentage." "Get off my land," Ezra said, his voice deadly quiet. "All of you, get off my land right now." Now, Rick said with the smooth tone of a practiced salesman. "Let's be reasonable. These people have driven hundreds of miles, some from as far as Ohio and Virginia. They're here seeking God's healing touch. Surely you wouldn't turn away the faithful." But Ezra was no longer listening to Rick Pemberton. His attention had been caught by a commotion near the back pasture, where the crowd had gathered around his fence. People were pressing forward, trying to touch the donkey, some throwing objects over the fence, flowers, pieces of clothing, what looked like medical prescriptions. The donkey, which had always remained calm and gentle with visitors, was clearly distressed by the chaos. It had retreated to the far corner of the pasture, as far from the crowd as possible, but people were climbing over and around his fences to get closer. "That's enough," Ezra roared, surprising himself with the volume of his voice. The crowd turned toward him, and he strode through them, with a determination that made people step aside. "This animal is frightened and stressed. Everyone needs to leave immediately." "But we've come so far," a woman pleaded, clutching a photograph of what appeared to be a sick child. "Please, just let my grandson touch it. The doctors say he only has weeks left." "I'm sorry for your grandson," Ezra said, and he truly was. "But this isn't helping anyone. Look at the animal. Can't you see it's afraid?" It was true. The donkey was showing clear signs of stress, ears pinned back, head high, moving restlessly in the small space left to it. This was not the calm, peaceful creature that had brought such comfort to individual visitors. "Maybe if we organized it better," someone suggested, "formed a line, limited the numbers." "No," Ezra said firmly, "this ends now. Everyone off my property." But even as he spoke, more cars were arriving. Word had spread on social media, and people were driving from ever-increasing distances. Some had brought tents and sleeping bags, apparently planning to camp on his land until they could have their moment with the miracle donkey. The situation was spiraling beyond anything Ezra could control alone. He was considering calling the police when he heard the familiar sound of horses' hooves on gravel. Bishop Hostetler arrived with 4 other men from the district, all of them looking grimly determined. "Ezra," the bishop said as he climbed down from his buggy, "we've come to help." The other men, including Jacob Yoder and Samuel King, positioned themselves strategically around the property, while Bishop Hostetler approached the crowd with the calm authority that came from decades of leadership. "Friends," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "I understand you've come seeking healing and hope. These are natural human desires, and there's no shame in them. But this gathering is causing distress to both the animal you've come to see and to the man whose property you're on. I'm asking you as a fellow believer to respect that and leave peacefully." "Are you trying to hide God's miracle?" someone called out from the crowd. "Don't we have a right to seek healing?" "You have a right to seek healing," Bishop Hostetler agreed, "but you don't have a right to trespass on private property or to cause suffering to one of God's creatures in the process." The crowd was becoming agitated, and Ezra could see the potential for the situation to turn ugly. Some people were arguing among themselves, others were still trying to push toward the donkey, and the tour operator was loudly insisting on his right to bring paying customers to see a public miracle. Then something happened that stopped everyone in their tracks. Little Ruth Yoder arrived. David and Mary had brought their daughter back, hoping for another peaceful moment with the donkey that had brought her such joy the day before. But when they saw the chaos surrounding Ezra's farm, they started to turn away. Ruth, however, had other ideas. Despite her weakness, she began to cry when she saw they were leaving without visiting the pretty donkey. Her cries were heartbreaking. The sound of a dying child denied one of the few things that had brought her comfort. The crowd, hearing the child's distress, gradually fell silent. They watched as David carried his obviously sick daughter through the throng, and even the most determined miracle seekers stepped aside to let the family pass. "Please," Mary said to Ezra, tears streaming down her face. "She's been asking for the donkey all night. The doctors, they think it might be today or tomorrow. Could she just see it one more time?" Ezra looked at the dying child in her father's arms, then at the crowd of strangers who had invaded his peaceful life, then at the donkey cowering in the far corner of the pasture. His heart was breaking for all of them. The desperate families, the frightened animal, even the misguided people who thought they could buy miracles for $20. "Yes," he said quietly, "but only Ruth. Everyone else needs to move back." To their credit, the crowd complied. Something about the presence of the dying child had sobered them, reminded them that this wasn't entertainment or a tourist attraction. This was about real suffering, real hope, real desperation. Ezra opened his back gate and led the Yoder family into the pasture, something he had never done before. The donkey, seeing that only familiar faces were approaching, began to calm down. It walked slowly toward them, its great head lowered in the gentle manner they remembered. Ruth reached out from her father's arms, her small hand finding the donkey's soft muzzle. "Hi, pretty donkey," she whispered. "I came back." What happened next would be talked about for years afterward, though everyone who witnessed it would remember it differently. The donkey lowered its head further, bringing its face close to the dying child. Ruth leaned forward and, with the unconscious trust of innocence, pressed her forehead against the animal's brow. They stayed that way for perhaps 30 seconds, child and creature in perfect stillness, while 200 people held their breath. When Ruth finally pulled back, she was smiling, not the weak, fevered smile of the day before, but a radiant expression of pure joy. Her eyes were clearer, her breathing easier, and when she spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been in weeks. "Mama," she said, looking at Mary with wonder, "the donkey told me something. What did it tell you, sweetheart?" Mary asked, her voice shaking. "It told me not to be scared. It said everything's going to be all right." David's hands were trembling as he held his daughter. "Ruth, how do you feel? Are you feeling better?" "I feel good, Papa. Really good. Can we go home and play with my dolls?" The change in the child was undeniable. The fever flush was gone from her cheeks, replaced by healthy pink color. Her breathing was deep and easy, and she was sitting up in her father's arms with strength she hadn't shown in weeks. Mary sank to her knees in the grass, sobbing with relief and disbelief. "Thank you," she whispered, whether to God or the donkey or Ezra himself. No one could tell. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The crowd erupted. People were crying, shouting, praising God, and demanding their own chance to approach the donkey. The peace of the moment was instantly shattered as desperate parents pushed forward with their own sick children, and the donkey, frightened by the renewed chaos, bolted to the far side of the pasture. "That's it," Ezra shouted above the noise. "Everyone out, now." It took another hour to clear his property, with some people leaving voluntarily while others had to be escorted off by the Amish men who had come to help. The tour operator threatened lawsuits, several people demanded refunds for their travel expenses, and more than one person accused Ezra of hoarding a divine gift that belonged to all humanity. By evening, Ezra's farm was finally quiet again, but he knew the peace was temporary. Word of Ruth's apparent healing would spread faster than the morning's chaos had, and tomorrow would likely bring even larger crowds. He sat on his back porch as darkness fell, watching the donkey graze peacefully in the moonlight. The animal seemed none the worse for its stressful day, but Ezra felt profoundly shaken by everything he had witnessed. Had Ruth actually been healed, or was this a temporary rally that sometimes occurred in dying patients? He had no way of knowing, but he had seen the change in the child with his own eyes. Something had happened between her and the donkey, something that couldn't be easily explained or dismissed. "What are you asking of me?" he said aloud, addressing his words to the star-filled sky. "I can't control what people believe about this animal. I can't stop them from coming, from hoping, from demanding miracles. And I don't know if what happened today was divine intervention or coincidence." The donkey raised its head and looked toward the porch, as if it had heard his words. In the moonlight, its eyes seemed to glow with an inner light that was both mysterious and comforting. "Sarah," Ezra continued, "if you can hear me, if you're somehow part of this, I need to understand, is this animal here to heal others, or to heal me? Because I feel something changing inside me, something I thought was dead. I'm starting to hope again, to believe again, and that terrifies me more than all the crowds and reporters combined." A gentle breeze stirred the autumn leaves, carrying the scent of coming winter and the promise of renewal that would follow. Somewhere in the distance, a barn owl called to its mate, and the donkey settled down in the grass for the night. For the first time in 2 years, Ezra felt truly at peace. Not because he understood what was happening, but because he was finally willing to admit that some things didn't need to be understood. They only needed to be accepted with faith. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crowds, new questions about miracles and meaning, But tonight, under the vast canopy of stars, Ezra Stoltzfus felt the first stirrings of the man he used to be. A man who believed in wonder, who trusted in providence, and who knew that sometimes the greatest miracles happened not in our bodies but in our heart. The donkey, as if sensing his thoughts, raised its great head one more time and looked directly at him. In that gaze, Ezra saw a reflection of his own transformation, from a creature of burden to a bearer of hope, from isolation to connection, from despair to possibility. The real miracle, he was beginning to understand, might not be what the donkey was doing for others. It might be what it had already done for him. Dawn brought helicopters. Ezra woke to the thunderous noise of rotors overhead and stumbled to his window to see news helicopters circling his property like mechanical vultures. Below them, the situation from the day before had multiplied tenfold. His lane was completely blocked by vehicles, and people were camping in his fields, having arrived throughout the night. Someone had erected a large banner across his fence that read, "Ruth's Miracle, Donkey Heals Dying Child." Television trucks lined the road, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like modern-day prayers for better reception. But worst of all, someone had cut a hole in his back fence. Ezra threw on his clothes and ran outside, pushing through the crowd of strangers who had turned his yard into a carnival. When he reached the back pasture, his heart nearly stopped. The donkey was surrounded by people who had climbed through the damaged fence. Some were kneeling in prayer, others were trying to pull hairs from its tail and mane as blessed relics, and a few were actually trying to climb onto its back. The magnificent creature was trapped in the center of the chaos, turning in circles as people pressed in from all sides. Its eyes were wide with fear, and it was making distressed sounds that Ezra had never heard before. "Get away from it!" Ezra shouted, but his voice was lost in the noise of the crowd and the helicopters overhead. He fought his way through the people in the pasture, using his shoulders and elbows to push through the throng. When he finally reached the donkey, he was horrified to see that someone had tied ribbons and pieces of cloth around its legs and neck. The animal was trembling with terror and exhaustion. "That's enough," Ezra roared with a fury that surprised even him. "Get away from this animal right now." The people closest to him stepped back, but the crowd beyond them continued to press forward. Ezra began untying the ribbons and cloth, his hands shaking with anger and concern for the creature that had brought so much peace to his life. "Sir," a reporter thrust a microphone toward his face, "can you confirm that your donkey healed Ruth Yoder yesterday? Are there other documented healings?" "It's not my donkey," Ezra snapped, still working to free the animal from its decorations. "And it doesn't heal anyone. It's just an animal that needs to be left alone." "But witnesses say they saw a miracle," the reporter persisted. "Are you denying that divine intervention occurred on your property?" Before Ezra could answer, a new voice cut through the crowd. "Let me through. Medical emergency." Patricia Williams, the Yoder family's physician, was pushing her way through the crowd, with David and Mary Yoder following close behind. But they weren't carrying Ruth. "Mr. Stoltzfus," Dr. Williams called as she approached. "We need to talk, privately." The tone of her voice made Ezra's stomach drop. He looked at David and Mary's faces and saw grief so profound it took his breath away. "Ruth," he whispered. Mary's tear-stained face told him everything he needed to know. "She passed this morning," David said quietly. "Peacefully, in her sleep. She was talking about the pretty donkey right until the end." The news hit Ezra like a physical blow. The child who had seemed so much better, so full of life and strength, just yesterday, was gone. The apparent miracle had been nothing more than a dying child's last rally before the end. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "So very sorry." But the crowd had overheard, and the reaction was swift and ugly. Some people began demanding their money back from the tour operators. Others accused Ezra of fraud and deception. The mood turned from hopeful to angry in a matter of seconds. "You said it could heal people," someone shouted. "My son is dying of cancer. We drove 12 hours for nothing. This whole thing is a scam. Dr. Williams raised her voice above the crowd. Ruth Yoder was in the final stages of a terminal illness. What happened yesterday was not unusual. Many dying patients experience a brief improvement before the end. It's called a surge, and it's a well-documented medical phenomenon. Her words seemed to deflate some of the crowd, but others became more agitated. The donkey, still surrounded and increasingly panicked, began to rear up on its hind legs, its massive hooves coming dangerously close to the people pressing in around it. "Everyone back," Ezra commanded, but the animal was beyond calming now. 2 years of gentle peace had been shattered in 2 days of human greed and desperation. That's when Bishop Hostetler arrived, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind his buggy came a convoy of Amish men on horseback, more than Ezra had ever seen gathered together outside of a barn raising. They spread out across his property with quiet efficiency, their presence commanding respect, even from the most determined miracle seekers. "Friends," the bishop announced in a voice that carried clearly across the chaos, "this gathering ends now. This man has asked you to leave his property. This animal is clearly distressed, and a family is mourning the loss of their child. I'm asking you to show respect for all of these things and depart peacefully. What right do you people have to hide God's miracle?" Someone called out belligerently. Bishop Hostetler's expression remained calm, but his voice took on steel. "We have the right that comes from living according to God's will rather than our own desires. This animal has been turned into an idol, and these people have forgotten that true healing comes from faith, not from touching a creature they've decided is magical." The words stung because they carried the weight of truth. Ezra looked around at the chaos surrounding the donkey and realized the bishop was right. Somewhere in the past few days, people had stopped seeing this as one of God's creatures and started seeing it as a dispensary of miracles, a divine vending machine that would grant wishes in exchange for faith and persistence. "The donkey doesn't belong to any of us," Ezra announced suddenly. "It came here on its own, and it can leave the same way. All of you who want miracles, this isn't where you'll find them." With that, he opened every gate on his property, creating a clear path from the pasture to the road. The donkey, seeing the opening, didn't hesitate. It walked with dignity through the crowd that parted reluctantly before it, past the television cameras and reporters, past the disappointed miracle seekers and angry tour operators. At the end of Ezra's driveway, the magnificent creature paused and looked back. Its eyes found Ezra's across the crowd, and in that gaze, Ezra saw something that looked like gratitude and farewell and a profound sadness for what human desperation had made of its gift. Then the donkey turned and walked down the country road, its massive form growing smaller with each step until it disappeared around a bend, leaving behind a property full of confused and angry people who had no idea what they had just witnessed. The crowd began to disperse slowly, some people still hoping the donkey would return, others demanding explanations for what they saw as a cruel hoax. The news crews packed up their equipment, already composing stories about religious fanaticism and the exploitation of desperate people. By evening, Ezra's farm was finally empty except for the Amish men, who had come to help repair his fences and clean up the debris left behind. They worked in silence, understanding without words that their friend needed time to process what had happened. As darkness fell, Jacob Yoder approached Ezra, who was sitting on his back porch, staring at the empty pasture. "It's for the best," Jacob said quietly. "That animal was never meant to be caged or controlled or turned into something it wasn't." "I know," Ezra replied. I keep thinking about little Ruth. She found such joy in that creature, and now she's gone, and it's gone, and I'm not sure what any of it meant." "Maybe that's the wrong question," Bishop Hostetler said, joining them on the porch. "Maybe instead of asking what it meant, we should ask what it changed." Ezra looked at the older man questioningly. "2 weeks ago, you were a man frozen by grief," the bishop continued. "You hadn't been to church in months, barely spoke to your neighbors. lived like someone who had forgotten that life still had wonder and purpose. Today you stood up to crowds and reporters and defended one of God's creatures from exploitation. That sounds like change to me, but Ruth still died, Ezra said. The donkey didn't heal her or anyone else. People came looking for miracles and went away empty-handed. Did they? Jacob asked. I saw you with those families as I saw you comfort them. Listen to them, treat them with kindness even when they were demanding the impossible. I saw you show them what real faith looks like. Not faith in miracles and magic, but faith in simply doing what's right because it's right. Ezra was quiet for a long moment, remembering the faces of all the desperate people who had come to his farm. Yes, many had left angry and disappointed, but others had seemed to find something else, something they hadn't been looking for but needed just as much: human compassion, genuine care, a reminder that they weren't alone in their suffering. Ruth's parents thanked me before they left, he said suddenly. They said the time she spent with the donkey was the last time they saw her truly happy and at peace. They said that was miracle enough. There, Bishop Stoltzfus said gently. That's what it meant. The three men sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a barn owl called to its mate, and the familiar sounds of the Pennsylvania countryside gradually returned to Ezra's farm. Do you think we'll ever see it again? Ezra asked. The donkey? I don't know, the bishop replied, but I suspect it will be wherever it's needed most. Ezra nodded, understanding finally dawning. The donkey had come to him when he needed it most, when his heart was frozen by grief and his faith had turned cold and rigid. It had brought wonder back into his life, reminded him how to care for others, shown him that healing sometimes came not through dramatic miracles, but through simple acts of compassion and connection. Now it was gone, moved on to whatever place or person needed its particular gift. And Ezra, for the first time in 2 years, was ready to move on too. I think I'd like to come back to church, he said quietly. This Sunday, if that would be all right. Bishop Stoltzfus smiled in the darkness. You'll be most welcome, Ezra. Most welcome indeed. As his friends prepared to leave, Ezra walked one more time to the back pasture, where the donkey had spent its brief time on his farm. The fence was repaired, the grass was trampled from the day's chaos, but already nature was beginning to reclaim the space. In a few weeks, new grass would grow. In a few months, the scars left by desperate feet and grasping hands would fade. By spring, this would just be a pasture again, showing no sign of the extraordinary creature that had changed so many lives in such a short time. But Ezra would remember. He would remember the moment he first saw those intelligent eyes looking into his soul. He would remember the gentle way the donkey had comforted dying children and desperate families. Most of all, he would remember the way it had touched its muzzle to his chest and reminded his frozen heart how to feel again. Thank you, he whispered to the empty pasture, to the star-filled sky, to whatever providence had brought that remarkable creature into his life. Thank you for reminding me that miracles aren't always about getting what we want. Sometimes they're about becoming who we're meant to be. A gentle breeze stirred the autumn leaves, carrying the scent of coming winter and the promise of spring that would follow. And Ezra Stoltzfus, for the first time in 2 years, looked forward to seeing what tomorrow would bring. 3 months later, on a bitter February morning, Ezra stood in his kitchen, making coffee for two. The second mug had become a habit since Christmas, when he'd started having regular visits from David and Mary Yoder. They came every Sunday after church, not to talk about miracles or donkeys or the media circus that had briefly consumed their lives, but simply to remember their daughter and find comfort in shared grief. Today was different, though. Today marked exactly 3 months since Ruth had passed away, and the Yoders had asked if they could hold a small memorial service in the pasture where their daughter had found such joy in her final days. Ezra heard buggy wheels on gravel and looked out to see not just the Yoders arriving, but a small procession of families from the district. Bishop Stoltzfus was there, along with Jacob and Samuel and their wives. To his surprise, he also saw Williams climbing out of her car, followed by several English families he didn't recognize. He stepped onto his porch, suddenly self-conscious about hosting such a gathering. In the months since the donkey had disappeared, his farm had returned to its peaceful routine. The reporters had moved on to other stories, the miracle seekers had found other causes, and the tour operators had taken their business elsewhere. But apparently, some people hadn't forgotten. Ezra David Yoder called as he approached. "Thank you for allowing this. It means more than I can say." "Of course," Ezra replied, though he was puzzled by the number of people gathering in his yard. "I thought it would just be family." "Word spread," Mary explained, her voice still soft with grief, but stronger than it had been in the autumn. People Ruth touched during her time with the donkey wanted to pay their respects. Dr. Williams approached, carrying a small bouquet of winter flowers. "Mr. Stoltzfus, I hope you don't mind my coming. Ruth's story has been on my mind a lot these past months. I've been thinking about what I said that day, about medical surges and natural phenomena. What about it? I may have been too quick to dismiss what happened. As a doctor, I see dying children rally before the end fairly often. But what I witnessed between Ruth and that donkey, there was something different about it, something I can't explain in medical terms." Before Ezra could respond, another voice called his name. He turned to see a middle-aged woman walking toward him, leaning heavily on a cane but moving under her own power. It took him a moment to recognize her as the woman with multiple sclerosis who had driven down from Scranton. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, remembering her name suddenly. "That's right," she smiled. "I wanted to come back and thank you." "Thank me? But the donkey didn't heal you. You're still sick, yes," she agreed, "but not still dying inside. That day I spent here, watching that gentle creature interact with all those desperate people, seeing how you cared for both the animal and the visitors, even when they were making your life difficult. It changed something in me." She paused, leaning more heavily on her cane. "I went home and started volunteering at a hospice. I figured if I was going to be sick, I might as well help other sick people. Turns out I'm pretty good at it. Turns out having a disease that's slowly taking your mobility gives you a unique perspective on what other patients are going through." Ezra stared at her, not sure how to respond. "The miracle wasn't that I got healed," she continued. "The miracle was that I stopped waiting to be healed and started living with purpose again. I learned that from watching you that day." More people approached with similar stories. The man with cancer from Harrisburg, who had started a support group for terminal patients after his experience at the farm. The young mother with the baby born with a heart defect, who had founded a charity to help other families with medical expenses. The elderly couple whose grandson had been in a coma. The boy had died 2 weeks after their visit, but they had begun working with the hospital's family support services, helping other families navigate the terrible journey of losing a child. "I don't understand," Ezra said to Bishop Hostetler, as more and more people shared their stories. "They're all still dealing with the same problems they came here to solve. Their diseases haven't been cured. Their loved ones haven't been healed. How is that miraculous?" "Because they found something better than healing," the bishop replied quietly. "They found purpose in their pain. They learned to transform their suffering into service to others. That's not just miraculous, Ezra, it's holy." As the small memorial service began, people formed a circle in the back pasture where the donkey had spent its brief time. David Yoder spoke first, his voice steady despite his tears. "Ruth loved that donkey because it was gentle and patient and kind. She said it had sad eyes, like it understood what it felt like to hurt. But she also said it had happy eyes, like it knew that hurt wasn't the end of the story." Mary stepped forward, holding a small wooden cross that Samuel King had carved from oak. Oak from the very tree where the donkey had liked to rest. "We're not here to worship an animal or to claim we witnessed a miracle," she said. "We're here to remember a little girl who found joy in simple things, who taught us that sometimes the most important healing happens not in our bodies, but in our hearts." She planted the cross in the ground where the donkey used to graze, and we're here to thank whatever providence brought that gentle creature to our lives, even if we can't understand why it came or where it went. Bishop Hostetler offered a prayer, asking for comfort for the grieving and wisdom for the living. Then, unexpectedly, Dr. Williams stepped forward. "I've been a doctor for 25 years, she said. "I've seen medical miracles that defied explanation, and I've seen faith healing that was nothing but wishful thinking. What happened here last fall was neither of those." She looked around the circle of faces, all of them marked by loss or illness or grief. What happened here was something rarer and more precious than physical healing. You all experienced grace. Not the kind that fixes everything, but the kind that helps us live with what can't be fixed. The kind that transforms our wounds into wisdom, our pain into compassion. A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering, and Ezra felt something shift inside his chest. For months he had been troubled by the question of whether the donkey had been truly miraculous or merely coincidental. Now he was beginning to understand that he had been asking the wrong question. As the memorial service concluded and people began to drift back toward their vehicles, Ezra found himself walking alone to the spot where the wooden cross now marked the donkey's favorite resting place. The oak tree was bare of leaves, its branches reaching toward the gray winter sky like arms raised in prayer. "Sarah," he said softly, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, "I think I finally understand what you've been trying to tell me all these months." He knelt beside the simple wooden cross, his weathered hands touching the bark of the old oak tree. It was never about the donkey healing other people, it was about the donkey healing me. And it wasn't even really about the donkey at all, it was about learning to see God's presence in unexpected places, in gentle creatures and dying children, and desperate families looking for hope. Tears began to flow down his cheeks, but for the first time in 3 years, they weren't tears of anger or despair. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition, of a heart finally ready to heal. "I spent 2 years being angry at you for taking her," he continued, his voice breaking. "I thought faith meant getting what we want, that prayer was supposed to change your mind. But maybe faith is about accepting what we can't change and finding ways to serve others who are walking the same difficult path." He stayed there for a long time as the other visitors said their goodbyes and went home. The sun was setting behind the bare winter trees when he finally stood up, his knees stiff from the cold, but his heart lighter than it had been in years. As he walked back toward his house, he heard the sound of horse hooves on gravel. A buggy was coming up his lane, not departing like the others, but arriving. He shaded his eyes against the setting sun, and was surprised to see a young Amish couple with several small children. "Are you Ezra Stoltzfus?" the man called as he climbed down from the buggy. "I am. I'm Thomas Miller, from over in Bird in Hand. This is my wife Rebecca. We heard you might have room for a family that's fallen on hard times." Ezra looked puzzled. "I'm not sure what you mean." Rebecca stepped forward, holding a baby who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. "Thomas lost his job at the furniture mill when they closed down before Christmas. We've been staying with my parents, but there are too many people in too small a house. Bishop Hustetler mentioned you might need help with your farm and that you have extra room in your house. The bishop suggested this. He said you've been talking about wanting to do something meaningful with all the empty space since your wife passed." Thomas explained. "We're good workers, and we wouldn't be any trouble. We just need a place to stay until I can find steady work again." Ezra looked at the young family, the tired parents, the wide-eyed children, the baby who was starting to fuss in the cold evening air. His house had indeed felt too large and empty since Sarah died. He had 4 bedrooms that went unused, a kitchen table that seated 8 but fed only 1, a life that had shrunk to fit his loneliness. "How many children?" he asked. 4, Rebecca said apologetically, as if this might disqualify them. "I know that's a lot." "It's perfect," Ezra interrupted, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "It's absolutely perfect. Come on, let's get you all inside where it's warm." As the Miller family unloaded their few possessions and began to settle into rooms that hadn't heard children's laughter in decades, Ezra stood in his kitchen and marveled at how full his house suddenly felt. not just with people and noise and activity, but with purpose. This was what the donkey had been preparing him for. Not to receive a miracle, but to become one for someone else. Not to be healed from his grief, but to use his grief as a bridge to understand other people's pain and need. That night, as he listened to the sounds of a family settling in upstairs, children whispering to each other across the hallway, parents speaking in low, relieved voices, a baby being soothed back to sleep, Ezra felt Sarah's presence more clearly than he had since her death. Not as a ghost or a vision, but as a living memory of what it meant to make room in your heart and home for others. Sarah had always been the one to invite struggling neighbors for dinner, to take meals to new mothers, to open their door to anyone who needed shelter or comfort. Now, finally, he was ready to carry on that legacy. He walked to his bedroom window and looked out at the back pasture, moonlight silvering the grass where an extraordinary creature had once grazed. The wooden cross was barely visible in the darkness, but he could feel its presence, a reminder of all the lives that had been touched and changed by a brief encounter with grace. "Thank you," he whispered to the night, to Sarah's memory, to whatever divine providence had orchestrated the events of the past year. "Thank you for bringing me back to life." Somewhere in the distance, a barn owl called to its mate, and from upstairs came the soft sound of a child laughing in her sleep. Ezra smiled, pulled the curtains closed, and went to prepare for the first morning in 3 years when he would wake up not to emptiness, but to a house full of people who needed him. The donkey had been gone for months, disappeared as mysteriously as it had arrived. But the miracle it had worked lived on, not in dramatic healings or supernatural interventions, but in the quiet transformation of hearts open to wonder, purpose, and love. And in a farmhouse in Lancaster County, where the sound of children's voices once again filled rooms that had been silent too long, Ezra Stoltzfus discovered that some miracles don't end when the miraculous creature departs. Sometimes, that's when they truly begin.